I've worked as a night security guard at this shopping mall for about 6 months now, and honestly, I used to enjoy the peace and quiet of the job. The mall's enormous, with these wide-open spaces that feel cavernous at night. The silence is so intense you can hear the faint buzz of the air conditioners, and the dim lighting gives the whole place an eerie vibe. Mannequins lined up in darkened store windows always seemed like they were watching me. But back then, I thought the job was simple: just monitor the cameras, patrol every couple of hours, and clock out at sunrise. One thing I noticed during my first week was the camera setup. It was straightforward. Cameras numbered 1 through 16, each showing a different part of the mall. But camera 5 stood out. It was pointed at a corridor leading to the basement, which, as far as I knew, was supposed to stay locked at all times. I remember asking my supervisor about it, and all he said was, "Don't worry about camera 5, as long as you follow the rules." He didn't elaborate, and I didn't press him. At first, I just avoided looking at it. Something about that dim, lifeless corridor gave me the creeps. During my first few nights, I kept my distance from camera 5. It was always on, displaying that same stretch of hallway. Nothing ever seemed to happen down there, at least not at first. The other cameras were easy to monitor. Empty corridors, still mannequins, the occasional flicker from the older systems. But camera 5 felt different. It wasn't just the way the corridor looked darker than it should, even with the lights on. Sometimes, I'd catch myself staring at it for longer than I realized, as if something was just out of frame, waiting to come into view. Then one night, something small but unsettling happened. I was scanning the monitors like usual when I noticed a shadow move across the frame of camera 5. It was quick, like someone walking by, but when I rewound the footage, there was nothing there. The shadow wasn't recorded. I told myself it was just a glitch or maybe a trick of the light, but it didn't sit right with me. After that, I started keeping one eye on the monitor, even though I hated how it made my skin crawl. A few nights later, things got worse. Around 3 a.m., I was halfway through my shift when I heard a metallic clanging echo through the mall. It sounded like it was coming from the basement. My first thought was that maybe something fell, but I remembered the access to the basement was locked, and no one was supposed to be down there. I checked the monitors, and there it was on camera 5. A janitor's cart, the kind with the mop and bucket, was slowly rolling down the corridor. There was no one pushing it. I stared at the screen, trying to convince myself it was just the air conditioning moving it or some uneven floor. But then the cart stopped, dead in its tracks. It didn't slow to a halt like it had hit something. It just stopped, as if someone had grabbed it. I felt my chest tighten, and for the first time, I considered calling my supervisor. But what would I even say? Hey, the cart moved by itself? He'd probably tell me to stop watching horror movies and get back to work. The next night, I couldn't shake the unease from what I'd seen. The mall felt different, like the silence was heavier somehow. I tried to keep my routine, but every time I glanced at the monitors, camera 5 seemed to pull my attention. Around 2 a.m., I noticed something new. A figure standing at the far end of the basement corridor. It wasn't moving, just barely visible in the grainy feed. I leaned in closer, squinting at the screen, but the more I focused, the less distinct it became, like it was dissolving into the static. Before I could process what I was looking at, the screen glitched, just for a split second. When it came back, the corridor was empty again. No figure, no sign of movement, nothing. My hands were trembling, and I hadn't even realized I'd stopped breathing for a moment. I told myself it had to be another malfunction, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I didn't dare rewind the footage this time. I just switched to another camera and tried to push it out of my mind, though the knot in my stomach refused to go away. A few nights later, something happened that I still can't explain. It started with the radio. I keep it on for communication, though it's usually silent during my shift. But this time, a low, crackling static broke through. I grabbed it, expecting to hear my supervisor or maybe a coworker messing around. But instead, there was a voice, distorted and faint. It was hard to make out, but it sounded like it was saying, "Look at the camera. Look at the camera." My blood ran cold. I glanced at the monitors, and of course, camera 5 was the only one showing movement. Against every instinct screaming at me to ignore it, I looked. The corridor was empty, but something was off. The camera angle, it wasn't right. It was tilted slightly upward, as if someone had adjusted it. Then my heart nearly stopped. In the center of the frame, clear as day, was a person. They were facing the camera, but their features were blurry, almost like they were vibrating or out of focus. What froze me wasn't just seeing them there. It was the way they tilted their heads slightly, like they knew I was watching. I stared at the monitor, paralyzed. My mind raced through possibilities. Was this a prank? A glitch? Someone who somehow got into the basement? But none of it made sense. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, its head tilted at that unnatural angle, as if studying me. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. My chest felt tight, and my fingers gripped the edge of the desk so hard they ached. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the screen glitched again, and the corridor was empty. I knew I should have called someone, but I didn't. Something about what I'd seen made me feel like it wouldn't help. Instead, I got up and left the monitor room, determined to check the basement door myself. My steps echoed through the mall, and with each one, I felt more and more like I wasn't alone. When I reached the basement entrance, I stopped. The heavy metal door was still locked, just as it should be. But the air around it felt wrong, cold and heavy, like I was standing too close to a freezer. My hand hovered over the handle, but I couldn't bring myself to touch it. I backed away from the basement door, every instinct screaming at me to leave it alone. My shift wasn't over, but I decided to stay in the break room instead of returning to the monitors. The silence of the mall felt oppressive, like the whole place was holding its breath. I tried to distract myself, scrolling through my phone, but every few minutes, I found my eyes drifting to the door, half expecting something or someone to come through. It didn't, but the sense of being watched never left me. When I finally mustered the courage to return to the monitor room, it was a little past 4 a.m. My heart sank as soon as I walked in. The screens were all showing static, except for one, camera 5. The corridor was empty again, but the angle was different. It was as though the camera had been moved to point directly at the stairwell leading to the monitor room. My chest tightened, and I felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck. It was then that I heard it, faint, deliberate footsteps coming up the stairs. The sound of the footsteps was slow, deliberate, like whoever, or whatever, it was wanted me to know they were coming. My hands shook as I scanned the room for something, anything, I could use as a weapon. All I found was a metal flashlight, but it felt useless against the dread crawling up my spine. I stared at the monitor, watching camera 5, but the screen didn't show anyone coming up the stairs. The footsteps, however, were getting louder. I don't know what possessed me to do it, but I reached for the intercom system that connected to the mall speakers. My voice cracked as I said, "Who's there?" The footsteps stopped. I froze, holding my breath, waiting for a response. Nothing. Then, as I lowered the microphone, I heard a faint noise behind me, a rasping, like a long exhale. The air in the room turned icy, and when I turned to look, I swear I saw a shadow move across the wall, though there was no source of light to cast it. I could barely think straight as I sat there, clutching the flashlight like it was my lifeline. The monitors flickered, and for a split second, I saw something that nearly made me scream. My own face, staring back at me from camera 5. But it wasn't just my reflection. The angle was impossible, as if the camera were inside the monitor room itself, filming me from behind. I whipped around, expecting to see someone, but the room was empty. My reflection on the screen smiled, just barely, before the monitor cut to static. That was the breaking point. I bolted out of the room, flashlight still in hand, my footsteps echoing through the empty halls of the mall. I didn't know where I was going. I just wanted to get as far from that room, and that camera, as possible. But as I rounded a corner, the air changed. It was heavy and cold, and the faint hum of the mall's systems seemed muffled, like I'd stepped into a vacuum. That's when I saw them, figures blurred and humanoid, stepping out from the edges of the shadows, their movements slow and deliberate, like they were herding me towards something. I froze, my mind screaming at me to run, but my legs refused to move. The figures didn't walk like people, they swayed, their limbs bending in ways that didn't look natural. I took a shaky step backward, and as if on cue, one of them turned its head toward me. Its face, or whatever it had instead of a face, was indistinct, a blur of static and shifting shadows, like watching a broken TV screen. My stomach churned as it raised an arm, pointing past me, toward the corridor leading back to the monitor room. I didn't want to go back there, but something about the way it gestured made it clear I didn't have a choice. The others began to close in, and I realized there was no way out. I stumbled back the way I came, my breath coming in short gasps. The hall seemed longer than before, stretching endlessly, but I didn't stop. When I finally reached the door to the monitor room, I slammed it shut behind me and locked it. The monitors were all static now, except for camera 5. This time it showed the stairwell again, but the figures were climbing, slowly and steadily, coming straight for me. My mind was racing as I scanned the room for anything that could stop this. That's when I noticed something I hadn't seen before, a folded piece of paper wedged under the edge of the keyboard. My hands shook as I pulled it free and opened it. The message was scrawled in rushed handwriting, almost illegible. Turn off the camera. No matter what happens, turn it off before it sees you. My heart sank. Turn it off? How? The system didn't even have a direct power button for individual cameras. The footsteps on the monitor grew louder, echoing like they were right outside the door. I couldn't think, I just acted. I grabbed the main power switch for the monitors and yanked it down. The screens went dark, and the room was swallowed in silence. For a moment, I thought it had worked, but then I heard it, faint but unmistakable, a knock at the door. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. I backed away, clutching the flashlight, my eyes darting around the pitch-black room. That's when the radio crackled to life again, and a distorted voice whispered, "Too late." I stood there, frozen, as the air in the room grew heavier, almost suffocating. The silence that followed the radio's crackle was worse than the noise. It pressed down on me, making every second feel like an eternity. Then the doorknob started to turn slowly. My heart pounded as I stumbled backward, my flashlight trembling in my hands. I pointed it at the door, waiting for it to swing open, but it didn't. Instead, it stopped halfway like whoever, or whatever, was on the other side wanted me to know they could come in any time they wanted. Then, without warning, the lights in the mall flickered back on. The hum of the air conditioning returned, and the monitors powered up on their own, one by one. I expected to see static again, but every camera was back to normal, except camera 5. It was blank, just a black screen. I didn't wait to find out what it meant. I grabbed my things and left the room, walking as fast as I could to the main exit without looking back. My shift wasn't over, but I didn't care. Whatever was in that basement could stay there. As I stepped outside into the crisp morning air, I felt a wave of relief, brief but enough to steady my nerves. The sun was just starting to rise, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, a stark contrast to the oppressive darkness I had just escaped. I didn't even bother locking the door behind me. The thought of stepping foot in that mall again was out of the question. My mind was still racing with questions, but I knew one thing for sure. I was done with that job. A few days later, I saw a news article about the mall. They were hiring a new night security guard. The job listing mentioned basic duties and included a line that sent chills down my spine. Familiarity with monitoring systems, especially camera 5, is preferred. I stared at the screen, feeling a cold sweat creep over me. It wasn't just the job posting that got to me. It was my reflection in the monitor as I read it. It blinked. But I hadn't.